Okay, welcome back to another exciting episode of Math Algebra 12.6, page 812. Here we go. So, last section, I'm getting started right away because we have a lot to cover. So, last section, we learned about multiplying and dividing fractions with polynomials. And we factored them and then could cancel things out. It was super fun because we could just cross out a bunch of stuff. Well, today we're adding and subtracting, and it won't be quite as easy because when you're adding and subtracting fractions, they have to have a common denominator. Okay? Remember, if you had a 1/3 plus a 4/6 back in 5th and 6th and 3rd and 4th grade, before you could add those two together, you had to change this one to also be a 6. Do you remember that? You multiplied it by 2, and then you did the same to the top, and that became a 2 over a 6, and then you could add it to a 4 over 6, and then you could just add across the top, put the common denominator on the bottom, and you would be able to finish out the adding, okay? The same thing is going to apply to us, but in a little bit more complicated way because we're now doing polynomials. But we still have to follow that same rule. To add them together, you have to have a common denominator. So example 1 on page 812, luckily for this one, they're starting you out easy. You do have a common denominator. So remember, when we're adding fractions, we put it still over our common denominator, and then we add the top. 5 plus 7 is 12, right? Now, the last thing we have to do is check and see if we can reduce that. Well, I can reduce a 12 over 3, I'm pretty sure, right? 12 over 3 can reduce to 4 over 1, but I don't really need the 1 if I have under a fraction, right? So just 4 over 1, but I still have this x right here. You can't forget, don't leave it out. It's still part of my answer. So when I'm done adding, I need to look and see if I can reduce my numbers, and if I can, go ahead and do that, 4 over x. Okay, now let's look at this next one here on this in green. So thankfully this one also has a common denominator. So I put x minus 1 as my common denominator. And then this one, careful, is subtracting. Now, you have to be careful of this because this is subtracting this entire thing, okay? So it's really, I'll write it down here, 3x minus x minus 5, right? Because that subtraction sign applies to everything on the top here. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and do 3x minus x, which would be 2x, and then we have a minus 5. Okay, remember we learned in the last section, you can't cancel things out across this line if they're added or subtracted as something else. So I cannot cancel out these x's, they have to just stay. So I've now subtracted these two fractions, and this is my answer. I can't reduce anything. Okay, now, they're going to give you some more. They're going to start you off easy like those ones with common denominators. But then they're going to give you some that don't have a common denominator. And we have to learn how to make a common denominator. Okay, so let's look at example number 2. And we'll learn how to make a common denominator. Our first fraction is 1 over 4r cubed. Nope, just 4r. Just kidding. Okay, our second fraction that they give us is r plus 3 over 10r cubed. Okay, now notice the directions. Oh, I'm still just totally kidding. It's r squared. Wow. Okay, notice the directions say find the least common denominator of the rational expression. So we're not actually adding or subtracting anything in this example. We're just learning how to find the least common denominator. Okay, so I'll show you how to do it the longhand way, but as we do more of them, you might be able to kind of tell what it is right away as you're kind of learning how this is done. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down each of these bottom denominators, okay? So let's start with my 4r. 4r, if I'm going to break it down, it's a 2 times a 2 times an r, right? Okay, I just kind of factored it, basically, was what I did, like if we had a factor tree, right? Okay, so now let's do our 10r squared. Okay, so what we do is we figure out what makes 10, which is a 2 and a 5, and then I have 2 r's. Okay, so I kind of factored both of them. Now, to make our least common denominator, what we can do is if both of them have one of the things, we only have to write it down once. Okay, so they both had a 2, so we just wrote it down once, and that's been taken care of. Now this one has another 2, and this one has a 5, so we have to write those down. And then they both have this r. So we just have to write it down once if they both have it, okay? And then we have an r, an additional r. So let's figure out what this is. 2 times 2 is 4 times 5 is 20, r squared. So let's look at, this is our least common denominator right here. Let's look and see how we can do it without writing all of that out if we don't want to. The smallest number that 4 and 10 can both go into is 20. And then you have to use the most exponents because r has to fit in r squared, but r squared has to also fit in r squared. So when you're dealing with your exponents, pick the biggest one because both of them have to fit into it, okay, on their own. So the smallest number that 4 and 10 go into is 20. And then we have to pick the biggest number of exponents. And that's how we find our least common denominator, okay? Or you can do it this long way if that made sense to you and helped you do it. That's totally fine as well, okay? Now, sometimes you'll have parentheses. And what in the world do we do with parentheses? Well, let's try that one. Example 2b. We have a 5 over a x minus 3 squared. And our other fraction is a 3x plus 4 over x squared minus x minus 6. Okay, because you're used to doing this from the last section, you probably remember that you're going to have to factor this before we get going on anything else, okay? So let's go ahead and factor that right here. Okay, we have an x and an x. Okay, what makes 6 but added together makes -1? I think we could use a -3 and a +2, right? That's a -6, but added makes a -1. So we factored it. So now let's go ahead and write out long again. I'm going to do it out long for this one as well so you can see where I got this from. Okay, x minus 3 squared is really this, right? Okay, and then our x squared minus x minus 6, when I factored that, I got an x minus 3 and I got an x plus 2. Okay, so now remember the rule is if they both have one of something, like these ones do right here, you only have to write it down once for your common denominator, and that's taken care of, okay? But then we also have to write down everything else that we have left. So we also have an x minus 3 again, right here, and an x minus 2, plus 2 also. So the least common denominator of these fractions would be x minus 3, x minus 3, x plus 2. Probably they would want you to write x minus 3 squared, right? Because there's 2 of them. That's the more proper way to write that. And this would be our least common denominator. I know it's super confusing, but what you're going to do is you're going to factor and see what you need from each one. I have to make sure that I have every piece necessary that they will go into. So with these parentheses ones, it might be easiest to factor them out and then do this long way. Well, if they have one and the same thing, you just have to write it once. But then you have to write everything else that's remaining. Okay, so let's try example number 3. I know we didn't do 2C, but I want to make sure we have time to do these other examples. And these ones are kind of confusing because we're actually going to start adding. So let's go ahead and move on to example number 3. Okay, do they have a common denominator on example number 3? They do not. So we have to figure out what our common denominator is going to be. So we're adding. So let's write this down. 9 over 8x squared. 9 over 8x squared plus 5 over 12x cubed. Okay, so step number 1 is to find my common denominator. Okay, so let's figure that out. The smallest number, I'm going to write it right here, least common denominator. The smallest number that 8 and 12 both go into would be 24, right? So I'm going to have a 24 for my number. And remember, for your exponents, you're going to use the biggest one. So the biggest exponent here is there's a 2, there's a 3. So I'm going to use the 3. And that's my least common denominator. Now, just like we do with regular fractions, I need to multiply to be able to turn this into my least common denominator. So how do I turn an 8 into a 24? I have to multiply it by 4, right? Oh, sorry, 3. 3. And there's 2 x's, but I'm supposed to have 3, so I need one more of those. But if I multiply it on the bottom, I have to multiply it on the top as well, right? That's the rule. So this would become a 27x, right? Okay. And our common denominator is 24x to the third. Now let's change this one. The 12 would need to multiply by a 2. My common denominator has 3 x's, and this already has 3 x's, so we don't need to give it any more. So it's just a 2. Let's be fair and do it to the top one as well, just like we would with normal fractions. 5 times 2 is 10, and we put it over our common denominator. Okay, now our common denominator is there on the bottom. We can just slide it over, and we're going to go ahead and add the top. 27x plus 10. Are these like terms here? This one has an x, this one does not. So they're not like terms, so we cannot add them together. So we can simply leave it like that, 27x plus 10. And that's as simplified as it can get. Okay, let's go ahead and do example 4. Example 4 has some parentheses on the bottom, not just regular numbers. So 10 over 3x, and then minus 7x over x plus 2. Minus, it's a minus. Be careful when you go to do this that you remember that you're subtracting. So in this case, our least common denominator is kind of weird. We need a 3x for this one. This one doesn't have anything like that, so that's just part of what our common denominator is. We need an x plus 2 for the bottom of this fraction. This one doesn't have anything like that. So really, to do the common denominator on this fraction, you need this one and this one. So our least common denominator is this crazy weird thing like this. Okay, so let's go ahead and trade. This one, or, change things up. So 3x, I have a 3x, it would need an x plus 2. So be fair and do it on the top and the bottom. So it's going to be a 10 times an x plus 2 over the common denominator, right? Okay, so then we're going to subtract x plus 2 to be the common denominator needs this 3x, so we're going to multiply it by 3x. Okay, so we put it over our common denominator. And a 7x and a 3x multiplied would be a 21x squared, right? Because we're supposed to be multiplying them. Okay, so let's go ahead and distribute right here so that we can put this all together. All right, this would become a 10x, right, and a 20. All right, so now we can combine them all together. We have a negative, we're going to put them in order of exponents, a negative 21x squared plus a 10x plus a 20, and we're going to put it all over our common denominator. Okay? A little crazy, I know. It's a little crazy. You can definitely call me or text me or email me with questions because this is a little crazy. We have time to do one more example very quickly. Okay, and that's example number 5. Okay, I'm going to do it super speedy because I'm running out of time. Okay, example number 5. I've got x plus 4. As I write it up here, I'm going to go ahead and factor that bottom polynomial because we can't do anything without it being factored. So we have a negative 10 and a 3. So I think I'm going to use a 5 and a 2. And what is it? It's a negative 10, positive 3. Okay. And then I'm going to do minus an x minus 1. And I'm going to go ahead and factor that one side too. As I put it up there, it's an x and an x. I have a minus 8. So I think that's going to be a minus 4 plus 2. Right? Oh, no, we're going to do a plus 4 minus 2. I didn't see that was that way. Okay. All right. So now we need to do our common denominator. So they both have an x minus 2. So let's write that one down. And that's taken care of. But I need an x plus 5 and an x plus 4 as well. Okay. Now we got to multiply. This one's missing the x plus 4. This one is missing the x plus 5. Okay, so then go ahead and multiply. That'd be x squared. I'm going to FOIL it while I'm doing it because I'm running out of time. X squared plus 8x plus 16 minus x squared. Let's see, that'd be 5 plus 4x minus 5. you would add